Not from the state, Your Honor.
Mr. Arbor, anything?
No, Your Honor, but Mr. Fawcett might ask for just a moment. He has pre-marked some exhibits for identification, and we're entering them in right now, so we can give it back to him and save some time rather than doing it during the witness's testimony, if that's okay. But whatever, however you want to do it.
I just need them back before I start.
Right.
And we'll now ask the state call your first witness, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state would call John Wallace to the stand.
Sir, if you would please stand, place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Mr. Fawcett,
Thank you, Your Honor.
if you could make sure your microphone's on so everybody can hear you, sir.
Yes, Your Honor. Please state your name.
My name is John R. Wallace.
Where do you generally live, sir?
I live in Raleigh, have lived in Raleigh for a number of years.
And what do you do for a living?
I have a law practice. I've been in private law practice since 1978.
Do you specialize in any particular areas of practice?
Over the years, I have specialized both in commercial litigation and in election law.
Where is your law office located?
My office is presently at 3737 Glenwood Avenue, out Glenwood, just inside the Beltline.
And how long have you been at that location?
I believe we moved in the fall of 2008.
And is there next to you a residential high-rise complex here?
Yes, there's a residential apartment building that has historically been known as Beckana. It now has a new name, but Beckana is the name by which we have known it.
Do you know former U.S. Congressman Brad Miller?
I do.
Please tell us about your professional association with Mr. Miller.
I knew Mr. Miller as a practicing attorney, and I knew Mr. Miller as an active Democrat and Democratic office seeker and office holder. And I have served Mr. Miller's federal committee, his campaign committee formed in connection with his campaign for Congress as treasurer of that committee.
When did you become the treasurer of Mr. Miller's federal campaign committee, roughly?
As I recall, he was reelected in 2008, and shortly after that asked me to undertake the role of treasurer for the committee.
And what were your responsibilities and duties from 2008 on as the treasurer of the Brad Miller Congressional Campaign Committee?
The committee is a committee registered with the Federal Election Commission, and the Federal Election Commission prescribes rules for the preparation of reports of receipts, and which come in the form of contributions primarily, and expenditures, which come in the form of disbursements to consultants for media buys or whatever. And my primary role was to comply with that regulatory scheme by the submission of required reports.
And Did you at some point get to know Jamie Hahn and Jonathan Broyhill?
Yes, in, I believe, early 2011, I was introduced to Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill when Ms. Hahn's company, Sky Blue, undertook responsibility for Mr. Miller's next congressional campaign, which would have been the 2012, in the 2012 election cycle. Prior to that time, there was another firm with whom I had worked. I believe it was known as Ad Astra, and I had worked with that other firm in providing my service as treasurer. And that firm departed, and Sky Blue came in to provide that campaign consulting service, including compliance services that had previously been provided by Ad Astra.
Okay. And once Sky Blue came in, did you meet Jamie Hahn and Jonathan Broyhill?
I did.
And what was the allocation of responsibilities as far as Sky Blue? What were they being responsible for as to Brad Miller's congressional campaign?
At the outset, Mr. Miller was expected to be a candidate on the 2012 general election ballot, and Sky Blue was a general consultant to the campaign, which would have included an array of responsibilities from fundraising to campaign strategy, but also included those matters that related to the compliance responsibilities of the committee, such as the depositing of contributions, the disbursement of checks, maintenance of appropriate records of those contributions and disbursements, and assistance in the preparation of the reports that I was then obligated to review and file with the Federal Election Commission.
Okay. Tell us about the Sky Blues, the evolution of their duties as relates to, as we get to early 2012.
During the year 2011, redistricting occurred such that Congressman Miller and Congressman Price were placed in the same congressional district, so that Mr. Miller was confronted with the question of whether or not to seek election in what had been the 4th congressional district, a seat held by Congressman Price. Mr. Miller, at some time during the late fall or early 2012, determined not to seek election in that district, such that the campaign committee, rather than mounting a campaign for the 2012 season, instead went into a different mode whereby indebtednesses were to be retired and funds preserved for or in the event that Mr. Miller decided to seek other office at some later time.
Did the fundraising stop in 2012?
I was not actively involved in the fundraising. I believe the fundraising certainly was not an active form of fundraising at that time.
Can you explain the quarterly FEC reports that were due and how that would be prepared and how your responsibilities? Just tell us that process. So new here.
Certainly. The campaign, as I understood its workings, that is to say the activities of Sky Blue and others that ran the campaign, maintained offices in the vicinity of Cameron Village. The campaign maintained its bank account with PNC, and I believe banked regularly at the Clark Avenue branch of PNC. The campaign maintained a post office box, I believe, at the Cameron Village post office. And so the activities of the campaign were in and about the Cameron Village area. The banking, therefore, occurred from the office of the committee at the Cameron Village branch. upon entering of deposits into the committee bank account or prior to the actual deposit, data would be entered into a computer program which would properly maintain an accounting of the receipts and contributions of the committee. And then checks dispersed from the committee account would be entered into the software program as well, such that all of that data would be present, preserved for the purposes of preparing a report when that quarterly reporting responsibility came about for the committee. And quarterly reporting was the case during 2012. There was a report due on April 15th, as I recall, which would have covered the period from January 1 through the end of March. And so the committee staff, that is to say Sky Blue, would have had responsibility for the maintenance of this information. And this information then would be utilized by the software to generate a report in the form and format that was required for submission to the Federal Election Commission. Now, at that time and for that committee, the filing occurred electronically. That has not always been the case, but in 2012, filing would have occurred electronically, and the report would contain an indication of my signature to it in the form of an electronic signature.
And during these quarterly reports that were filed, can you tell us a typical quarterly meeting and who you would meet with throughout 2012 and before we get into April 2013? But typical meeting, of quarterly meeting 2012 as far as you and Sky Blue.
Certainly. It was our practice, and I'm referring to Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill and myself. It was our practice to meet in my offices, in my conference room, and to review documents prepared by Sky Blue, which included drafts of the federal report, reconciliation pages that reported pending activity. In other words, contributions received but not yet appearing in the bank statements, disbursements made but not yet appearing in the bank balances, and other related documents. We would have a discussion about the status of the campaign, its activities, the nature of the disbursements which were being reported, the nature of the disbursements which would need to be made in the future. And that kind of discussion occurred for 15 minutes to a half hour every quarter, more often than not with Ms. Hahn and Ms. Broyhill, but sometimes with only Mr. Broyhill present.
And during these quarterly meetings, would the copies of the bank statements of the campaign normally be shown to you?
As I recall, there were one or more pages from bank statements attached to the reconciliation sheets that were provided to me at that time. I was not regularly in receipt of the bank statements from the bank. Instead, they were mailed to the post office box or the office of the committee. But I was provided with one or more pages from bank statements during the course of those meetings.
And you had no access to the P.O. box?
I did not.
Who did?
I don't know to a certainty, but I presume that it would have been the staff, Sky Blue, which was, I believe, the only staff of the committee at the time.
Were you a signator on Congressman Miller's congressional campaign bank account?
I was not.
Okay, do you know who was?
I believe that Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill each appeared as signatories. Mr. Miller may have been as well.
Would these reconciliation sheets and the attachment of maybe a couple pages of bank statements, was the purpose of this was to justify the draft FEC report being shown to you for approval?
at least in part, we had discussions that went beyond just the accuracy of the report, but went to questions such as what's the nature of this disbursement? What are the purposes for this disbursement? What disbursements do we anticipate in the future? What is the plan with respect to these surplus funds? So there were discussions that went beyond the mere accuracy of the draft report.
Okay. And were copies of blank checks ever attached or provided to you during these quarterly meetings, the actual checks?
No, sir.
Any correspondence from the bank or from the FEC that was mailed, would that have been mailed to your law office?
I was not the addressee for the committee with the Federal Election Commission, nor with the PNC Bank.
Do you know where those documents would be mailed to?
The committee's address on the FEC reports for purposes of FEC communications was a post office box at Cameron Village.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
We get them marked, right?
States Exhibit 102 for identification purposes. Mr. Wallace, do you recognize what States Exhibit 102 is?
Yes, I recognize that to be an image of Ms. Hahn.
Thank you. And let's direct your attention to April 15th, 2013, a Monday. If I may show you States Exhibit 5. Do you recognize what States Exhibit 5 is?
Yes, sir. States Exhibit 5 is a printout of one page of my Outlook calendar from my computer on my desk in my office.
And as to your calendar for that Monday, April 15th, 2013, what is reflected as far as any meetings with anybody involved in this matter?
I have a meeting scheduled for that morning. I believe it's at 9 or 9:30 with Ms. Hahn.
Did you in fact meet that morning with Ms. Hahn?
With Ms. Hahn and with Mr. Broyhill.
Okay.
I'm sorry, just to be, April 15th, correct?
Correct.
All right, thank you.
Your Honor, the state would offer an evidence, States 102 and States 5.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
They are allowed 102 for illustrative purposes.
This Monday, April 15th, 2013 meeting, can you tell us the purpose of that meeting with Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill?
Yes, sir. A report was due to be submitted electronically to the Federal Election Commission on that day. Ms. Hahn and I had had some communications during the prior week, and I believe we'd had a scheduled appointment which got moved back to the morning of the 15th. And it was at that time and in that meeting that I was presented with a draft of the report which was to be submitted to the commission, due to be submitted to the commission that day. And the purpose of that meeting was to review that draft and discuss the status of the committee's affairs.
Okay. And my intention is to show you this draft report, but if you would, before we get to that, can you just tell us how long this meeting occurred and summarize what occurred at the meeting, please, that Monday morning?
Certainly. The meeting was like other meetings we have had. There were but three of us in my conference room, but it was an informal meeting at which documents were provided to me. We had generally a free-flowing discussion about what I saw or what raised questions or thoughts in my mind. Discussion about the plans for the disposition of the committee's assets, because the committee was in a winding down mode at that time. I reviewed what I saw on the draft report, raised questions to the extent that I had questions regarding matters appearing there. And in this particular meeting, I did have a question because the report showed a continuing indebtedness to Mr. Miller, to Congressman Miller, which I had been led to believe had been retired. And so I noted that discrepancy and requested that the draft report be amended so as to reflect the retirement of that indebtedness.
Were any bank statements shown to you during this meeting in relation to this first quarter FEC file?
I do not recall specifically, but it certainly had been the practice to provide what was known as the reconciliation sheet and bank statement or bank statement pages.
That was the practice, but you don't recall?
I don't recall specifically seeing those items in the course of that meeting.
Can I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
What's marked as State's Exhibit 4 for identification purposes. Do you recognize, Mr. Wallace, what State's Exhibit 4 is?
It appears to be the report of the Brad Miller for United States Congress Committee, which was submitted on April 15, 2013.
Okay. And submitted to,
The Federal Election Commission.
and on that date, and what time on that date?
It appears to have been submitted at 10:27 a.m.
Okay. Is State's Exhibit 4 consistent with the draft report that was presented to you for your approval?
State's Exhibit 4 on its last 3 pages.
Well, maybe, let me ask you, is State's Exhibit 4 consistent with what was shown to you at the meeting?
I believe so, yes, sir.
With Jamie and the defendant?
I believe so, yes, sir.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time the state will offer an evidence. State's Exhibit 4.
Any objection?
I just examine it for 1 minute.
Yes,
just for
sir.
Sure.
With State's Exhibit 4 into evidence, Your Honor, at this time I'd ask that we publish that to the jury as I ask Mr. Wallace questions. I do have 14 copies here.
That'll be fine if you'll hand those to the bailiff. Again, members of the jury, you're being given a document to examine. If you'll do so carefully, individually, and without comment. And if you wish to take notes, please do so on your notepads. Mr. Fawcett, will you be asking questions while the jurors are examining, or are you asking that they examine it fully before you ask any further questions?
I'll ask questions while they're examining.
All right, so if you'll just allow Mr. Fawcett to direct your attention to the exhibit.
As to State's Exhibit 4, could you take us through what we're looking at, please?
Certainly, we have the top page is a cover page, which also contains the electronic signature, which I referenced, and it of course identifies the name of the committee and the reporting period, which is addressed by the report. The next page, page
the
2.
reporting period is, what's this, number 5?
Block number 4, the middle of the page to the left, 4A, it says April 15th quarterly report.
And then number 5 gives you the date of the time frame that it covers?
Yes, sir.
Okay, continue, please.
The second page is what is a summary page which summarizes the contributions received, the expenditures made, sets forth cash on hand, debts and obligations owed to the committee, debts and obligations owed by the committee. And then we have those pages which are known as detailed summary pages, which describe the sources, in this case, the sources of the receipts, of which there were none, as I recall. It's reported by period and by the election cycle. In column A by period, in column B by election cycle.
Column A being the first quarter that we're talking about here.
Correct.
And we're not in a fundraising, we're in a wind down aspect.
Correct.
Okay, continue, please.
And column B reports the activity since the prior election. And then we get on to page 4 of 10, and I'm making reference to the page numbers in the upper right-hand corner of the page, and this is the detailed summary of disbursements. And the total disbursements are set for the period are set forth in row 22, and that number corresponds with the disbursements election cycle to date, which is at the bottom of column B, and that then is followed by a summary of cash, which shown on row 23. Cash on hand is reported in this row as $65,298.30.
That's at the beginning of 2013?
That's at the beginning of 2013, and then that number is reduced by the disbursements and shows on row 27 as the lesser sum, $62,914.52. And then there are pages which are described as itemized disbursements, and this is where individual itemized disbursements are reported. Now, this report does not have, but most reports would have, a schedule of itemized receipts that follow the detailed summary page and precede the itemized disbursements, but because fundraising was not ongoing, those pages were not required to be included. And following those pages that describe the itemized disbursements.
And the disbursements, according to this particular FBC filing, 7 checks, according to this filing, were dispersed from the account during the relevant quarterly time frame.
Yes, sir. No, those could have been those could have been disbursements by check or by debit card, but that's correct. And following the disbursement pages, there are 3 pages in this report which show the loans, the indebtedness that I made reference to. There are 3 different loans that Congressman Miller made to the committee, each of which is reported on a separate page, and then the cumulative total is reported at the bottom of the last page. And that's the indebtedness which I had understood to have been repaid, but which still appeared on the report of the committee.
Of those 3 separate loans, the original loan amount and dates are included in this information, correct?
That's correct.
But the outstanding balance at the time of this period was down to $14,006 and change.
That is correct.
As to some disbursements here, NCAJ Properties Incorporated, do you know what that means?
I believe, sir, that to be the North Carolina Advocates for Justice, who, an organization which maintains its offices on Annapolis Drive, a building which housed a number of smaller offices, and I believe that the offices of the Miller Committee were maintained in one of those smaller offices.
During this quarterly meeting with Ms. Hahn and the defendant, after the meeting, that was one concern. The concern you raised was about the indebtedness and paid back instrument.
What I saw on this report was inconsistent with what I had been told and was being told, and I made the request that the report be amended to reflect what I believe to be the facts.
And were you told at that meeting that the indebtedness had been paid back?
I was.
And who told you that?
I do not recall specifically, but it was my understanding from the conversation that the indebtedness had been repaid.
As to these typical quarterly meetings, would you sometimes, did you mention that you would meet solely with the defendant?
Yes.
And was your understanding, what was your understanding if you, as to the division of labor between Ms. Hahn and the defendant as to how Sky Blue would handle the responsibilities as to Congressman Miller's affairs?
I had not previously worked with Sky Blue, but my observation in working with Sky Blue from a time beginning in 2011 and up to 2013 was that there was collaboration between Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill, and some division of responsibility, which included, as I best could tell, overall campaign strategy and oversight, which was allocated to Ms. Hahn, and the management of the bank account and the preparation of the reports, which was allocated to Mr. Broyhill.
Okay. At times when you would meet with Mr. Broyhill, to your knowledge, where did he used to live in reference to your law?
During some portion of that time, from 2011 to 2013, and I think most of that time, Mr. Broyhill resided at Beckana, which was immediately to the north of my office.
Rather convenient for y'all to set up these quarterly meetings?
And the meetings were easily set up and in the same manner and same fashion in my office, I believe, on every occasion.
As to State's Exhibit 4 before you, Mr. Wallace, you've addressed and pointed out the date and time stamp of when it was filed with the FEC. Did you approve this particular FEC first quarterly filing, though?
No, I had, when this report or version of this report was presented to me earlier that morning, I had indicated that it required amendment before filing because it was seemingly inconsistent with what I had been told about the condition of the committee.
Did you request for either person or persons, Ms. Hahn or the defendant, to look into this and get back with you?
We had a good working relationship, and I had, when I had questions in times past, I had posed those questions and at some time thereafter received adequate, satisfactory answers. My instruction in this instance was that particular item be amended because I recognized it to be inconsistent with what I understood the facts to be. It did not necessarily require a response in the form of a communication with me. I did expect, though, that the report, as it had been prepared, would be amended before it was submitted to the commission.
Mr. Wallace, after that, how long collectively do you think that Monday morning meeting lasted?
It typically would have lasted a half an hour or so.
After that meeting, would you ever see Ms. Hahn or the defendant again?
In the normal course of events, I would see them 1 quarter later.
Right. After this particular meeting on April 15, 2013, did you ever see Ms. Hahn or the defendant again?
No.
May I approach the witness?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Wallace, let me show you some orders here. And I will give you State Exhibit 11 and 12 in conjunction with 10 in front of you there.
State's Exhibit 10 consists at the bottom of an email that I wrote on Wednesday, April 17th, 2 days following the meeting that I had with Mr. Broyhill and Ms. Hahn.
And what the purpose of the email you wrote, please?
The email is transmitted with a subject line that read simply "help!" exclamation point. And it makes reference to 2 letters attached hereto that I found on the Federal Election Commission website for the committee. And my request was simply that I get some response from Ms. Hahn and Ms. Broyhill about the 2 letters which I had transmitted to them in the email. And the 2 letters were the attachments, and these are those 2 letters attachments to the which I'd retrieved from the Federal Election Commission website for the committee.
Tell us about how that came about, and then if you would, tell us what, in fact, these 2 letters from the FEC you're now requesting help from Ms. Hahn and the defendant, Mr. Broyhill.
I am not sure exactly what led me from that meeting on April 15th to an examination of the website of the Federal Election Commission. But upon visiting that website, I saw that there were two letters, one dated October 1, 2012, States Exhibit 11, and another dated February 15, 2013, States Exhibit 12. And the first of the two, States Exhibit 11, makes reference to a need to file a response to provide additional information to the Federal Election Commission in connection with an earlier filed report which gave rise to questions on the part of the Commission.
Just generally, what were the questions, just the general subject matter?
The commission staff was concerned about some of the disbursements that appeared in the records of the committee as previously filed, and that request, which was transmitted to me by name, but to the post office address of the committee by actual address, was not a communication which I had previously seen, but which I found on the commission website, and as to which I became concerned because those questions appeared not to have been answered, not to have been addressed by the committee.
How about the next FEC letter you pulled down and sent to both the defendant and Ms. Hahn for a request for help?
The next letter, States Exhibit 12, reports that the committee had failed to timely file its report. And that report would have been the report, I believe, due in January, covering the last quarter of 2012. And so that was an expression of concern on the part of commission staff requiring a response by the committee. And it appeared to me from an examination of the commission's website that no response, particularly no report, had been submitted for the period or in response to the commission's request.
Sky Blue in response to the end of the 2012 quarterly report that it appeared to have been not filed according to that FEC letter?
I don't have a specific recollection of that meeting. I believe such a meeting likely occurred. It was our pattern and practice to do that.
Yes, sir.
I'll show you States Exhibit 13. The state would admit into evidence States Exhibit 10, 11, and 12 as identified and discussed.
Any objection?
No,
I'm sorry.
just double check. No objection.
All right, they are allowed.
Thank you. Your request for help was Wednesday, April 17th, 4:42 p.m., sent to both Ms. Hahn's email and Mr. Broyhill's email.
Correct.
Okay. Let me show you States Exhibit 13. Do you recognize States Exhibit 13?
States Exhibit 13 is the email response that I received from Mr. Broyhill at 3:45 p.m. on Thursday, April 18th, so approximately a day later. And in that response, Mr. Broyhill wrote to me, "Good afternoon, John. I am working on this now, and I will be in touch."
Hold on, Mr. Wallace. Moving for admission.
The state would move State Exhibit 13 to evidence at this time.
No objection.
All right, it's allowed. Go ahead, Mr. Wallace.
Thank you, Your Honor. And it reads, "Good afternoon, John. I am working on this now, and I will be in touch first thing in the morning."
Okay. Jonathan Broyhill sent to you, John Wallace, that email.
Correct.
Thursday, what time was that?
That was at 3:45 p.m. on Thursday, the 18th, 2013.
Did you ever hear back from Mr. Broyhill that the next day or ever again about any matter?
I do not believe so, sir.
Did you ever speak to Ms. Hahn, email or by phone ever again after that Monday meeting?
I do not believe so, sir.
After the events of April 22nd, Ms. Hahn's, did you become aware of some financial issues and proprieties as to the committee's bank account?
Upon learning of those events, and in light of my responsibilities as treasurer, I went immediately to the PNC branch on Clark Avenue, just across the street from Cameron Village.
I'm only going to object not with respect to the response, just ask for clarification to those events, because he's just talked about some exhibits, and I think now you're talking about different events now, if I'm not mistaken.
All right, if you could clarify for at least a time frame purposes.
I learned
Being what?
at some time of the death of Ms. Hahn. And following the death of Ms. Hahn and what I read about the arrest of Mr. Broyhill, and aware of the roles that each of those individuals played with respect to the committee, I communicated with Congressman Miller, and I made an almost immediate trip to the PNC branch at Clark Avenue across the street from Cameron Village to begin to gather those records that could be gathered from the bank, because the committee's records were not available to me at that time.
You know where the committee's records were?
The committee's records were, as I later learned, in the possession in part of Mr. Broyhill. Some, as best I was able to tell, were retrieved by the police department and were therefore unavailable to me. So I was at that point looking to the PNC Bank to provide records.
Were you able to get PNC Bank records for Congressman Miller's account?
I was.
Can I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, I would ask that through stipulations that States Exhibit 1, States Exhibit 2, and States Exhibit 3 be admitted into evidence as previously stipulated to, identified as the Brad Miller Congressional Campaign bank account records at RBC and the PNC when it changed ownership.
All right.
I think by stipulation they were previously entered.
Yes, sir.
No, so certainly there was no objection.
All right, so those are admitted. That's exhibits 1, 2, and 3 are admitted.
Just for the jury's purpose to know that they were stipulated.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, a stipulation is just simply an agreement among the parties. And in this case, the parties have agreed that these records would be received as authentic and admissible in this case.
Thank you. Can I approach? Have you had time to look over these records since those affairs in April 2013?
Yes, I have.
Let me direct you to States Exhibit 3 specifically, which is the 2013 bank account records here in front of me. For this time period of March 1st, 2013 to March 29th, 2013, the beginning bank balance was what, according to States Exhibit 3?
$2,831.93.
And it reflects at the end of March 29th, 2013, the ending balance to be what?
It appears in the balance summary as a positive cash balance of $3,587.05.
What did you learn about the, in fact, true nature of this? I'll circle this number, 3,587.06.
That was, in fact, a negative balance at that time.
The bank apparently doesn't report a negative.
I think
The
they're.
information you were provided.
I think that's correct.
Have you, since the events of April 22nd, 2013, had an opportunity to go back and look at the financial records provided by PNC and to identify misappropriated money according to checks written by the defendant to himself?
Yes, I had. I first set out to secure the bank account, and then I, as treasurer, had responsibility to examine the records, contrast those records with filed reports, and to correct any errors in the reporting that had occurred. And so I was obligated to dig into those records, both the bank statements and the images of the checks which had been negotiated, along with other related items, so as to be able to amend to correct reports previously filed with the commission.
At the end of your inquiry, did you in fact have to go back and amend these various, such as States Exhibit 4, these various quarterly FEC filings?
Yes, there were a number of reports dating back, I believe, to mid-year 2011, which required amendment.
May I approach the witness, Sean?
Yes.
These marked in, yeah.
Mr. Wallace, let me show you what's marked as States Exhibit 6. States Exhibit 8. And can you identify what States Exhibit 6, 7, and 8 are, please? Possibly on the back of each exhibit, you may find your signature possibly.
States Exhibit 6 consists of images from the bank account of the committee, images of negotiated checks. And those checks are from 2011. Exhibit 7 consists of images from the bank account of the committee, checks issued by the committee during 2012. And Exhibit 8 consists of checks issued by the committee during 2013.
These are in fact abstracts of the records already entered as States Exhibit 1, 2, and 3. Isn't that
That's correct. This is some of the underlying data that resulted in the preparation of the bank statements by the bank.
As to States Exhibit 6, 7, and 8, have certain checks been highlighted on the exhibit, circled, so to speak?
That's correct.
The state would offer the evidence, States Exhibit 6, 7, and 8 at this time.
No objection.
They are allowed.
Let me show you what's marked as States Exhibit 9 for identification purposes. Can you identify what States Exhibit 9 is, please?
States Exhibit 9 is a schedule of checks which was prepared utilizing Exhibits 6, 7, and 8. Exhibits 6, 7, and 8 each contained checks issued and drawn on the committee account, made payable to Mr. Broyhill and signed by Mr. Broyhill. And those are the items that are highlighted in orange. And those items were then entered into the schedule, which appears as Exhibit 9. And those are items which were dispersed by the committee, by Mr. Broyhill, to Mr. Broyhill on the utilizing committee funds, and they are summarized on this schedule, States Exhibit 9.
And in the summary, States Exhibit 9, have you in fact had an previous opportunity to go through and check the accuracy of proposed States Exhibit 9 as it relates to the underlying bank data of States Exhibit 6, 7, and 8?
Yes, I have. I've looked at each of the images contained in 6, 7, and 8 and confirmed the accuracy of the entry into the schedule, and I've noted on the back of Exhibit 9 that I have done so by placing my signature on the back of that exhibit.
At this time, the state would move States Exhibit 9 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection.
It's allowed.
Judge, the state would ask to publish, has 14 copies for the jurors this time of States Exhibit 9, the summary.
Yes, sir. If you'll hand that to the bailiff.
May I approach you?
Yes.
Mr. Wallace, the name of the software, do you understand that Sky Blue utilized to input various financial information for the Brad Miller congressional campaign? What is the name of the software?
The name, as I know it, is NGP.
Okay.
I don't. It's an acronym which I don't know the meaning of.
And after your own efforts getting access to the bank account records for the campaign, Brad Miller Campaign Committee, looking into these matters, did you share this information with Raleigh police investigators?
Yes.
ultimately you later would file amended FEC reports dating back some years?
From the time of this discovery until sometime in late July, I believe, or thereabouts of 2013, I went through an examination of records leading to the preparation and filing of amended reports, and also the filing of various other submissions with the commission arising from this matter.
Thank you. No more questions.
Cross-examination, Mr. Harbour, Ms. Elliott.
Thank you, Aaron. Check my watch. Good afternoon, Mr. Wallace.
Good afternoon, sir.
My name's Joseph Arbor. I'm an attorney, and I'm going to ask you some questions about your testimony.
Certainly.
I'll ask this question just because we're both attorneys in the Raleigh area, but we've never met before today, have
We have not.
Want to get some. You said you do commercial litigation, and you're also an expert in election law. Would that be fair?
I've practiced election law for a number of years. Yes, sir.
If I ask you something and it's incorrect, I'm going to defer to something of an election law nature. I'm going to ask you to go ahead and correct me because I'm sure you may have a better understanding of it than I do.
Mr. Harbour, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you make sure your microphone's on so we can?
It is, Judge.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But I'd like to get some clarity for the jury of exactly what this is that you were doing as a treasurer, because I don't think the average person necessarily knows. You've been involved in election law for how long, sir?
I believe my first active involvement with election law goes back to approximately 1980.
So we're, I'm guessing, fairly close in age, so we're pre-computer people.
Yes, sir.
So you know both processes, the ones that exist today and the ones that exist before, and you're familiar pretty much with everything that happened in between those times.
I have been at various times less actively involved and at other times more actively involved, but I've been in some way a participant for that time period since 1980.
Now, just right off the get-go, your testimony here has been primarily today about your involvement in the campaign of former Congressman Brad Miller, who I think you identified as being a member of the Democratic Party, correct?
He was the Democratic nominee and a member of the Democratic Party, yes, sir.
And this is a party with which you have been affiliated as well.
Correct.
It's not usually typical in the practice of election law for Democratic candidates to seek the assistance of, say, Republican election law experts. Would that be fair?
I think that's fair, yes.
And they tend to. Somewhere out there, there's your counterpart who does similar work to what you do, but for the Republican Party. Would that be pretty accurate?
One or more, yes, sir.
Yeah, I don't mean just that there's you and him, but there are not a lot of people though that do this. Would that also be fair to say?
I think that's correct, yes.
Which makes your knowledge of this information rather. I mean, you're fairly unique because there's not a lot of lawyers out there that do this type of work. Would that be correct?
Correct.
All right. And again, you correct me. The role of a treasurer is not. It sort of gives a connotation to maybe the average citizen that isn't exactly what the actual role is. Would that be fair?
Well, the role of the treasurer is statutorily defined both under state law and federal law. The actual role of a treasurer varies to some extent from campaign to campaign.
That's what I'm asking is, I think sometimes the average citizen who has no experience in the inner workings of politics might envision a treasurer as being almost like an accountant, like someone who's like poring over the bank statements and looking at things. That's not really what a treasurer does. Would that be fair?
Well, I think in some campaigns that is in fact the case, but in a modern and larger campaign that is not usually the case.
And just so we're also clear, we're dealing with a very specific entity because people can confuse the two. An elected official has, like Congressman Miller, has paid staffers, people that work for him, to do his work of being a congressman. And that is different from the campaign. Would that be correct?
Correct.
So in other words, when the jury's hearing this, they shouldn't assume this has nothing to do with his role as a congressman, Brad Miller's role as a congressman, or anybody working with him in Washington on the things he has to do as a congressman.
Now, correct. Congressman Miller had a congressional staff, and what we have discussed here today is that staff associated with his campaign committee.
Right. We're dealing with a U.S. congressman. This is a bigger office, a much larger office than most. Would that be fair?
A congressman's office?
Yes.
Staff members both in Washington, D.C. and in the congressman's district. So persons who are paid professionals providing their services to the member of Congress, yes.
It's like when a person, say for example, is like running for a small office in their local municipality or something like that, and they go into office. Most of the time, they're doing their own work, and they gather up friends and things to help them run for office. Correct?
Yes.
They form a committee that is designed to get them elected into the office that they're trying to get into. Correct?
Correct.
All right, and then that committee. Even small ones, it doesn't have to be a congressman, have responsibilities. They have to report their donations that they receive from contributors, right?
Correct.
They have to make note of their expenses that they spend as part of their campaign to largely to get elected a lot of the times, correct?
Correct. There is both a state regulatory scheme for those candidates who run for municipal or state office, and there's a federal regulatory scheme for those candidates that run for federal office. And someone running in a local election would be subject to that state regulatory scheme.
Right. Someone who's running for like a council seat in their local town, they don't have to deal with the Federal Election Commission. They're just dealing. But there's like a similar agency, a state committee.
A state board of elections, yes, sir.
Right, and this applies to anybody who's running for office, whether they're running for the small office, say dog catcher in town, right up to the point of a state senator or a governor.
Yes, sir.
Right. And then if they should decide to seek, if that individual should decide to seek a higher office, a federal office, they then must have a separate committee for their federal activity. Would that be fair?
That's correct.
So there'd be it's possible for an individual who has been in, and it's not untypical oftentimes for someone who is in a federal office to have previously sat in some state office prior to going for a bigger seat like a federal seat. Would that be
correct?
True? That's sort of the case here with Congressman Miller, correct?
Correct.
Congressman Miller was I believe, a state assemblyman here in North Carolina.
He was in the state Senate before being elected to Congress.
But prior to being a state senator, I think he was a member of the North Carolina House of Representatives.
I believe so.
So he did that for a period of time. And then after that, and to do that, he would have had a committee to get elected to that seat as a member of the State House of Representatives, correct?
Correct.
At some point, and you indicated that you knew him, you've known him for some while, both as a candidate, as you said, an office holder, an office seeker. He has sought other offices, correct?
I don't recall
Well,
what different elections he's been involved in as a candidate, but he ran, I believe, for and was elected to the state house at one time or another, and was elected to the state senate after that, and then ran for Congress and was elected there.
right. You you had been interviewed by the police after the events involving Ms. Hahn, after she was killed, regarding your involvement with Mr. Miller's campaign, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And when you were interviewed, you were telling them a little bit at that time about Mr. Miller and how he happened to become a member of the U.S. Congress, correct?
I do not recall specifically that conversation, but I certainly could have provided that sort of background to the Raleigh Police Department. Yes, sir.
As you said earlier, Mr. Miller had been a state assemblyman, member of the House of Representatives for the state of North Carolina, for which he would have had a state campaign committee, correct?
Yes, sir.
To get elected to that seat. Then at some point, he made the decision to run for the office of state senate.
Yes,
Correct?
sir.
And you're familiar with that.
Yes, sir.
And there would have been a campaign committee to get elected to that state senate seat, correct?
Likely the same committee as existed for any prior House race.
And that would be permissible to,
Yes, sir.
to roll that over. So whatever committee you started to become elected into the House of Representatives, that was sometime in the 90s, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then the decision in the mid-90s, I believe, to become a state senator, you could just sort of rename your committee.
That's typically the case, and I believe that's likely what happened in this instance.
And you weren't the treasurer at that time, but you were familiar with initially Representative Miller and then State Senator Miller.
I was not the treasurer during that time period, correct?
But you were familiar with him.
Yes, certainly.
Then there came a point in the early 2000s when Mr. Miller, along with a number of other people that were in state office, there was like a what they call a redistricting that basically redraws the lines of what is a voter district, correct?
Correct.
I mean, a voter district is comprised of certain neighborhoods and areas, and then those are the people in that district that vote for particular candidates, correct?
Generally, yes.
In the early 2000s, there was a redistricting or a redrawing of those lines that resulted in an opportunity for Mr. Miller to run for the United States Congress in the district in which he resided. And so he decided to enter himself as a candidate for this federal office of U.S. Congress, correct?
I believe so, yes, sir.
And when he did that, he would have at that point had to have opened up a new committee, a committee to be elected to the federal seat, correct?
Yes. It would be a committee subject to federal law rather than subject to state law.
Right. Now, the fact that you're expert in the field, that you might, I'm sure, can answer this question. The fact that you have now decided to abandon state office to become a federal official, Your job responsibility changes. You are not required necessarily by any election law requirement to close down any state campaign accounts that you may have opened when you were in state office. Is that correct?
That is correct. There's no obligation on the part of a federal office holder to close a state account.
Certainly there's no prohibition to doing it, but there's nothing that prohibits you from
Correct.
doing it. Or requires
Requires you to do it, correct.
Exactly. That is not uncommon. Would that be fair?
It's not unusual for a candidate elected to federal office to have and maintain an account, a committee account that was supportive of that candidate's pursuit of state or municipal office prior to election to federal office.
For any variety of reasons, correct?
Correct.
I mean, the very nature of politics is there is no job security. Would that be fair?
The election to Congress comes with a 2-year term.
So if you're going to run for Congress and you win the seat, you're in for 2 years, but you don't know what's going to happen 2 years down the road from then.
Correct.
So you might find yourself in a position where you might want to go back and run for a state office, correct?
Certainly.
By having your state committee account still active and open, you saved yourself the time of having to do that again.
That's certainly one reason to maintain an existing state committee account.
There are other reasons, correct?
Certainly.
Sometimes in the course of, and let's talk about accounts generally. I mean, the purpose of a campaign account, it serves a number of functions, but the primary one is it's get elected.
Well, a campaign committee bank account is, of course, required by law. And the disclosure of the activities in that account is required by law. The monies raised are, of course, raised for the purpose of enabling a candidate to be elected, but all of those activities, the raising of money for a committee account and the spending of that money are subject to a regulatory scheme and a reporting scheme.
That's correct. And there's public policy reasons for that too
Yes, sir.
as well, correct?
Yes, sir.
Part of the purpose of these this oversight into both, whether it's a state account, state campaign account, or a federal campaign account, is to give the government an opportunity to see a variety of things. Who's putting money into the account, right?
And I would add, it enables the public to see who's contributing to the account.
That's right.
Or how money may be expended from the account.
These are public records.
These are records required to be filed with several public agencies. Yes,
Right.
sir.
So if an individual wanted to go and see the filings of a candidate for office, they could go see them.
Online or physically, yes, sir.
Yes. And part of that purpose of being transparent is goes back to that public policy reason, and we want to make sure that our candidates who are in office don't have some, say, wealthy benefactor, pouring a lot of money into their account so that they can perhaps get some kind of personal return or benefit back. Correct?
There are limits imposed by law on contributions to committees, and there are reporting requirements. Those contribution limits and the reporting requirements are designed to prohibit excessive influence and to promote public awareness of the sources of contributions.
So because of that, there's a fair amount of scrutiny that's attached to these accounts, because any candidate who's running for an office, whether it's a state office or a federal office, is required to keep records of the money that's coming in, and that's what's being deposited into their campaign account, correct? And
Correct.
and then they have to report it on, for example, that one report that you were testifying about earlier. That's why they have to make the quarterly reports, right?
Yes, sir.
You also have to be transparent in what you spend out of the account, correct?
Yes.
So, and that's so that, you know, we don't see that any of our elected officials are giving overly large amounts to any particular party for what would be, might be perceived by the public as some inappropriate reason, correct?
Well, the reporting of disbursements, as with the reporting of contributions, is designed to enhance public awareness of the utilization of campaign resources so that the public can form judgments about the candidates.
So there's a fair amount of scrutiny that's attached to that.
Some.
And then when that happens, I mean, this isn't just for people who run in large office. I mean, you run, like I said, the guy's running for the dog catcher. If he has to run for an office, he has to report this stuff, the money that's coming in, and his expenses as well, correct?
Yes, there are exemptions at the lowest end of the scale, but beyond those exemption levels, reporting of receipts and contributions and reporting of expenditures is required under state law for all municipal and state offices.
And typically, when the offices are small or someone just getting into politics, their expenses are typically about, you know, the money that they spend on things to help them get elected. I mean, they might buy some pens or something that they're handing out at a, you know, event, or have some mailings sent out to prospective voters to tell them a little bit about themselves, to be reported as well, correct?
Yes, sir.
A lot of times when, particularly when a candidate is initially starting out, they don't always have the contributors necessary to all the activity they want to do, run their campaign, correct?
I think it's generally true that candidates are compelled by circumstances to engage in fundraising activities, and it's generally true that there's always need for more in order to be pleased and is able to spend enough to achieve election.
That need to raise money to get like that's increased over the years that you've been doing this type. But a candidate is first starting out now, particularly when they're first starting out, know a lot of people yet, or they may not have a lot of people able to contribute to their account. So they can put their own money into their campaign should they so desire to, right?
Candidates can contribute to the campaigns under state law in unlimited amounts, or may loan money to their campaigns amounts.
And then that money can be reports we were talking about as a debt, so that if at some point the campaign account have enough money in it to repay the candidate, that's permitted.
Correct. That's correct.
And there's rules and provisions about how the debt is to be paid, but that is permitted.
That is correct.
Sometimes candidates, in an effort to get elected to certain office, will incur debt that sometimes exceeds the amount of money that they have available to them from contributors to pay for their campaign. That happens sometimes.
Certainly.
It's not even uncommon for people who have lost election to continue to have, sometimes they'll even have a fundraiser to pay that debt off. Otherwise, they're responsible for some of that debt, correct?
Candidates may contribute to their campaigns, may loan money to their campaigns, may, if successful, be able to raise money to repay loans to the campaigns. If unsuccessful, certainly may engage in fundraising activities with the hope of repaying indebtednesses to themselves.
There was a time, I believe, while when Mr. Miller became a U.S. Congressman, the rules regarding campaign financing had changed from, say, the time when he was in state office. Would that be fair?
There has been some evolution in the rules with respect to what we call independent expenditure activity, but the core of campaign finance, the reporting of receipts, contributions, and expenditures is by and large the same as it has been since Mr. Miller first sought office.
I can't remember the year. You'd probably remember better than me, but sometime back in the mid-'90s, or prior to the mid-'90s, there was a time when if you were in U.S. Congress and you had a campaign account, and those accounts could get rather large at times, correct?
They can, yes.
Sometimes in the millions of dollars, right?
For some safe incumbents, yes.
Yeah, and back in, you probably know the year, but sometime before the mid-'90s, if a congressman left office or retired or left election, or lost his election and left office for that reason, they were able to actually at one time keep what was ever in their campaign accounts.
I don't recall that to be the case under federal law. That was the case under state law.
That law changed at some point where in the federal campaigns, U.S. congressmen were not permitted to keep what was ever in their state account in the event that they left office or retired from office or lost election. That is the case today, isn't it?
Money maintained in a state account for a candidate that does not seek office, is not in pursuit of office, may, under state law, only be expended in a limited number of ways. Under state law, the candidate may not pay unto himself monies in his state committee account except in repayment of indebtedness.
So if there's money in an account, the candidate is not permitted to just take that money, his or herself.
Correct.
If they can demonstrate that they have at some point loaned money to their account, which is permitted, they can then repay themselves from the campaign account for the loan that they extended to the committee.
And that's true under state and federal law.
Right. But there are limitations and rules about how that repayment is to occur. Isn't that true?
There are reporting responsibilities in connection with the repayment of those by a candidate to his committee.
The loans that we're talking about, the candidate may make to their committee. Not aware, I'm wrong on this, that there's any requirement for them to file with the Bureau any type of promissory note or any kind of document that evidences the loan. Is that correct?
That is a requirement of a written evidence of an, but a candidate making a loan to a committee would, on the subsequent filed report a loan as a loan on that report, on that next report. And then that loan remains on that report, remains as an outstanding indebtedness of the committee until retired.
So if I'm going to run for office and say I'm going to loan $30,000 into my account, into my campaign account to help me run for office, I would have to reference that on the filings, the kind of filings that you discussed that are in a quarterly statement, correct?
You could, as a matter of law, contribute to your committee, or you could loan money to your committee. And if you loan money to your committee, it's reported as a loan on a separate schedule to the committee's reports.
I could give myself the money
Yes, sir.
into my campaign account.
Yes, sir.
But if I put it in the form of a loan, then I at least open up the possibility that at some point I can get that money back repaid to me.
That's correct.
Hopefully I'll have enough contributions from, people who are contributing to my campaign to give that money back to me. So I don't have to use my money, right?
That's correct.
And a lot of candidates do that. They do make, rather than just donate money to their account, they make loans to their account so that if they are in a position to get repaid on the loan, they can get their money back, right?
That's correct.
Now, in 2012, and sort of like back at the time when Congressman Miller was himself a state senator, the North Carolina Assembly did something similar to when he became a U.S. congressman, and they redistricted the lines again, correct?
I believe the redistricting would have occurred in 2011, following the 2010 census, yes.
And when that happened, now prior to that happening, Congressman Miller, he'd been in office since, I believe, 2002. Does that sound about right?
I don't
As
recall.
a U.S. congressman.
I don't recall specifically, but that sounds about right.
Okay. I think your testimony was that you became the treasurer sometime after that. You were not the initial treasurer of the campaign.
That's correct. I didn't become treasurer until, I believe, 2009.
When he got into office initially, prior to your becoming the treasurer, you indicated that this Congress seat that he was sitting in, this is a House of Representatives seat. It's a 2-year term.
Correct.
So he would have had to run for re-election in 2004, 2006, 2008, 2000, and so forth.
Yes, sir.
And I don't recall specific, some opposition in those election terms.
I believe so, yes, sir.
So each time you have to run for office, every time you run for one of these 2-year election cycles, like I said, you've got your job that you're doing in Washington. One of the committee's jobs is to, while the congressman's doing his work, at least this is what you hope the committee's doing, is to try to raise money for the congressman, the seated congressman, so that he can be a candidate in the next election.
Yes, sir.
The money is needed to, like we said, pay for advertisements, mailings, all that stuff.
Yes,
correct?
sir.
And congressman, in order to be a congressman and do his job in Washington, can't be spent, at least we ideally would not like that congressman or congresswoman to be spending all their time getting reelected, although we hear a lot of stories about that. But usually there's people that do this as part of the campaign. They're doing this for the candidate while the candidate is at Washington doing their job, correct?
Yes.
All right. The committee that runs an election campaign for a congressman. Now, you did this one for Congressman Miller. Have you done any other, worked on any other campaigns of that, of any, how many have you worked on? Let me put it that way.
Oh, I've been involved in a number of campaigns dating back even prior to my first practice of election law, so a number of campaigns.
How many times have you been a treasurer?
On more than one occasion, but I don't recall with what frequency.
When a candidate has a committee that's running the campaign against, you got the, and I'm just trying to distinguish for jurors who may not be familiar. There's the two things. There's the congressman working in Washington, and there's a committee seeking to get that congressman reelected, correct?
Yes, sir.
And what we're dealing with when we talk about Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill and all the things, the Sky Blue strategies, we're not talking about his job in Washington. We're talking about this committee to get him reelected, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, as the offices get bigger, I'm not talking like the dog catcher thing, but, you know, a U.S. congressman, those elections can become very expensive, right?
Yes, sir.
The money spent on television and advertising can get pretty high. I mean, most people see it reported in the newspaper, usually around election time, around the news, about how much candidates are spending to get elected, right?
Yes, sir.
And a lot of it's the same thing with presidential races, no different. That money is being raised by these campaign committees, correct?
Yes.
And that was what Jamie Hahn, through her company Sky Blue Strategies, was hired to do for Representative Miller.
Beginning in early 2011, Sky Blue became a political consultant to Congressman Miller's committee and would have had the responsibility of oversight of the campaign, fundraising, compliance activities, and those other elements of a successful campaign.
So I'm going to get to thank you. The committees, sometimes as the office gets larger, the committees get bigger, correct?
Certainly can, yes.
And they have more people attached to them, correct? It's not, it's not, people can actually work for those committees, right? I mean, it can be a job.
Certainly.
Where that's your job. You work for I work for the committee to elect so-and-so into office, correct? So like a paid job.
Committees that are involved in campaigns for higher elective office have typically both employees and consultants.
Sometimes, which is also not untypical for political office, in addition to any, so that these people that work for the committee, they're like called paid staffers, right?
Certainly, could be.
Paying committee is not necessarily only comprised of paid to do it. There are also volunteers who do it, correct?
Correct.
And together run the committee, right? Right?
Together, those people comprise of a committee, yes.
And that staff may have a variety of designated response, right?
Correct.
These are the people that again, while the congressperson is working off somewhere, they're sending out the mail. Run a fundraiser, they're going to notify people of the fundraisers. They're going to, like, literally have we're going to have a banquet. We need someone to book the room and arrange the menu and the tickets and see who's going to pay for those tickets to come to these things. These are what the people do, right?
Among other things.
Among other things. But that's some of the other things.
Yes.
Mr. Arbor, we're going to resume at 2:30. Ladies and all the instructions, don't talk among yourselves or with anyone else about this. Opinions about the outcome. No media or independent investigation into these matters. Please have no conversation or communication with parties, witnesses, or lawyers. If you leave your notebooks in your chairs, gather in the deliberation room at 2:30. Everyone else, please remain seated while the jurors excuse themselves.